Dark is a German time travel murder mystery show that ran for 3 seasons on Netflix from 2017 to 2020. I only just watched it for the first time at the end of 2023 myself, having very deliberately ignored it at the time for being, by all appearances, yet another dreary Nordic-style cop drama a la The Killing, or The Missing, or The Fall. Maybe that's what you think Dark is too, if you think anything about it at all, which you probably don't because that title is just so forgettable. Which brings us to the first and most prominently recurring criticism I have about Dark. Its name. You could assemble a crack team of the world's greatest artisans of wretched nomenclature, the Einsteins of being bad at naming stuff, and even they couldn't concoct a title so hopelessly generic and void of information. It conveys nothing of the show's characters or underpinning philosophy, nor the tangled web of time travel nonsense that occupies so much of its runtime. All Dark tells us about the show is that it's dark, which you charitably apply to the tone and themes of the series, but which also applies to its often photographically dark images, especially in the final season. I open up with this specific criticism mostly to get it out of the way, because I know for me personally, the posters and the aesthetic and the absolutely nothing title utterly failed to sell me on this show. I only started watching it in the first place after finishing another time travel murder mystery on Netflix titled Bodies. Bodies has a great hook and a very strong first couple episodes, but the whole thing falls apart at the end for a whole host of reasons that we don't have time to get into right now. When looking up reviews for Bodies after the fact, I saw several people say, Bodies is like a shorter, stupider version of Dark, and that, dear strangers, was the moment I learned that Dark was about time travel. I'd been pretty hopeful about Bodies at first, so the idea of a longer, more thought-out version of that show that ended on its own terms enticed me enough to get over my knee-jerk titular aversion and give Dark an honest shot. And now I sit before you, a messenger from another time, well beyond the reach of cultural relevance or zeitgeist, here to point at a show you probably don't care about and say, hey, you should probably care about that. Much to my surprise, Dark is one of the most complex works of televisual speculative fiction I've had the pleasure to confront in years. And I mean it when I call this speculative fiction. This isn't an Indiana Jones film set in an Apple store like all other modern sci-fi. This is proper, head-scratching, roll-up-your-sleeves, take-home assignment style science fiction. It is a show for adults with an attention span, by which I mean it's good television and you should watch it because Lord knows we don't get this kind of thing very often. Of course, I don't have only nice things to say about Dark, but we'll get to that a bit later. My name is Sarah Zedek, my pronouns are she, her. If you care about spoilers, shut up, no you don't. Let's talk about Dark. Alright then, so what is Dark? For the first 3 episodes, it seems to be a relatively straightforward Nordic-ish murder mystery with a twist. The series opens with a man committing suicide by hanging, which is the second indication that you get that this series might be a little bit dark. A child has gone missing in the rural town of Winden, host to a soon-to-be-closed nuclear power plant, and the cops are at a complete loss for leads. Jonas Convald, son of the dead man, finally returns to school after a lengthy absence, only to find that the girl he has a crush on, Marta Nielsen, is dating his best friend, Bartosz Tiedemann. His attempts to win her back go awry when a midnight trek to the local spooky cave system to find some drugs leads to the sudden disappearance of Marta's kid brother, Mikkel. At the very same time, cops discover the body of an entirely different child wearing clothes and a Walkman from the 1980s, and all the while a hooded figure lurks in the shadows, watching, hefty briefcase in hand. From this starting point, an idea forms in your head of the show that this will probably turn out to be. Someone in the past or future must be kidnapping and killing children, then using time travel to hide the bodies. Jonas will be our perspective character for all the time travel stuff, while all the incidental characters fill out the textural and emotional facets of the setting. These first few episodes really do have a Twin Peaks vibe, with quirky townsfolk, a recurring police station, a wood-paneled hotel, and just a big old dollop of moody establishing shots to tie it all together. My general expectation with any mainstream sci-fi story these days is that the actual sci-fi parts will occupy, at best, 30 to 40% of the show's runtime. Realistically, probably a lot less, so my barometer for success is how interesting or complimentary all the other stuff is. And when it comes to the sci-fi parts, for American media, I call it a success when it's only about 60 to 70% incoherent gobbledygook. So if the time travel is fun and the characters are interesting and there's a couple good ideas every episode or two and the aesthetics run the line between amateur and tryhard, I'll probably be happy. But that is not the show that this is. A lot of genre TV these days, I just get the feeling like the creators, or more likely the executives, are embarrassed to be making something that is closer in nature to Lost than to Breaking Bad. That's why my expectations are so low for the sci-fi parts, because it's exceedingly rare in my experience for contemporary sci-fi to put as much thought into the nerdy nitty-gritty as they do into how shippable their leads are. It's Surf Draculas all the way down, and it's been so constant for so long that my standards may as well be trapped in a trans-dimensional tesseract at the center of a supermassive black hole, trying in vain to influence my past self to make better life choices. So imagine my astonishment when Dark, a show I totally wrote off at a glance 6 years ago, not only lets Surf Dracula surf, but goes out of its way to reveal that the entire cast is made up of Surf Draculas that each have their own uniquely twisted relationship to the Wave Master's art. From episode 4 on, and especially from the season 1 finale, the ramifications of time travel wind their way into every single subplot, seeping into the lives of even the minorest of characters, leaving anachronistic grease stains on any object worthy of note. Everything you think this show is at the outset is a lie, and the complexities of that lie are so exponential that they will remain occluded until the very last seconds of the series finale. This is part of what makes it so hard to summarize the show's plot beyond those first 3 episodes. What happens is a slow unveiling of everything that has always already happened. To talk about any of the plot is to just say the plot. For instance, March's brother Mikkel wasn't kidnapped, he just wound up on the other side of the time hole in 1986, where he's eventually adopted by Ines Conwald, changes his name to Michael Conwald, grows up, marries Hannah Kruger, who changes her name to Hannah Conwald, then they have a kid that they name Jonas Conwald. Oops! Sorry about your love life there, kid, but it turns out the girl of your dreams is actually your aunt. Happens to the best of us, am I right? That particular beat was an early sign that this is probably my kind of filth, because when it comes to time travel stories, everyone loves a paradox, but everybody hates thinking about incest. Part of Dark's charm is precisely that it's unafraid of the weirder, more uncomfortable possibilities that arise when you take time travel seriously as a dramaturgical tool in the Greek tragedy sense. And that's only episode 5. What I just described to you could be the premise and payoff of an entire season of television for any other show, yet in Dark, this is but one compelling subplot in a churning sea of equally compelling subplots, each being actively written by its own bespoke Surf Dracula. I cannot overstate how dense this show becomes, how thoughtfully constructed it is from minute 1. It's the rare show that refuses to close in on itself, but rather expands ever outwards, refusing to let the viewer get comfortable for long before blowing up their expectations. As the scope of its setting expands to include 1953, then 2052, then 1888, your own idea of what's possible expands commensurately. Recurring symbols, shot compositions, lines of dialogue all contribute to a sense that this is a story its creators have put a lot of care into, which is something I really can't say of a lot of its Netflixian peers. What really makes or breaks a work of speculative fiction for me is how fun it is to think about, and Dark is kind of a blast. It posits a theory of time travel that I find intoxicating from a philosophical perspective, namely that it can't be invented or discovered, but rather emerges as a natural consequence of the hypothetical possibility of its existence. There isn't a single device used for time travel in the show which was consciously engineered for that purpose. They are instead the result of time loops, built in ignorance on blueprints whose author was copying another's work. In this world, time travel paradoxically collapses the whole of history into a single simultaneous moment that is both its own predecessor and its own successor. Always the end, always the beginning. A book with no author or an infinity of authors, all laboring under the hubristic assumption that defying linear chronology is the same thing as having true free will. Through its frequent invocation of the Ouroboros, the triquetra, of knots and loops and recurring cycles, Dark explores a sort of nihilistic determinism. That we are, all of us, the architects of our own demise, especially when we dedicate our lives to avoiding that fate. Once the plot gets going, a lot of the Nordic-ish settings and character stuff take a back seat. What Dark is most consistently interested in is the slack-jawed moment of abject terror, almost Lovecraftian in nature, when an otherwise innocent person is confronted by the hypocrisy of their future self and the accidentally incestuous chicanery that will inexorably drive one to become the other. In this way, time travel is like character drama antimatter. It obliterates reason, logic, and motivation, leaving previously vibrant characters with nothing but a grim obligation to the predetermined course of events. It's a really unique way of exploring how, as some people get older and lose sight of their youthful rebellion, they slowly become the thing they always fought against, seek to uphold all the systems they once swore to destroy. How age seems to rob people of their ability to imagine anything that isn't always already this, whatever this is, until the end of time. But I don't want to sell Dark's characters too short. Time travel in this show operates on a 33-year cycle, so we end up seeing most main characters at 3 different phases in their life: as teens, as middle-aged adults, and as ragged elders. Central to this conceit is the idea that each of these intervals represents a philosophical turning point. Series antagonist Adam lays it out in Season 2, saying that we each live 3 lives. The first ends with the loss of naivety, the second with the loss of innocence, and the third with the loss of life itself. As young Jonas meets his older selves, he is disgusted by them and commits himself to never becoming anything like them, and each says to him flatly, "I remember being where you are and spending years convinced that I would never become the person that I am today, and yet I am the person I am today, and I believe it." It's a bleak theme for a very bleak show, but the actors who play Jonas's various selves are all so good that it really does work. This poor kid, man. Straight people are not okay. But Jonas's arc is the spine upon which the rest of the series hangs, so yeah, one would hope that his character is done well by. Of particular note in the supporting cast is Katarina Nielsen, the school principal and mother of Mikkel, who is slowly driven off the deep end by the sheer ludicrosity of the show's plot. One of my frustrations with Dark is that it has approximately 2 emotional registers: brooding and existential meltdown. Katarina is one of the only characters who, upon being told about Wyndon's time traveler infestation, gets to laugh and be outraged at the audacity of it all. Then there's Inspector Clausen, this show's resident Agent Dale Cooper analog who only appears in Season 2. His place in the narrative is bizarre, in part because, by the point of his introduction, he's basically the only one who doesn't know what's really going on in Wyndon. He exists to resolve a subplot involving the identity of the current director at the nuclear plant that was opaquely set up with precisely 1 scene in Season 1, so by all rights it shouldn't work, but the actor playing Clausen imbues every second of his time on screen with a coy, understated confidence that makes him one of the most memorable characters in the whole show. Of course, it helps that he's also one of the only characters whose motivations are entirely his own. My favorite character by a landslide, however, is Claudia Tiedemann, the first woman to become director of the Wyndon power plant in 1986. She enters the scene as an exorbitantly fashionable, well-styled upper-class person eager to do a good job. But then she finds her childhood dog Gretchen, who disappeared in the caves 33 years ago, and then her older self, a bedraggled silver-haired witch who has spent her life waging war against Adam and his followers. While Jonas is technically Dark's protagonist, Claudia is pretty much the only one who gets to demonstrate any real agency by the series' end. It's no coincidence that she's also the only character with any actual first-hand knowledge of nuclear physics. Relatedly, I adore the performance of her elder father, Egon Tiedemann, a cop who is just so bad at his job, and yet he tries so hard. I also have to praise the casting choices across time periods. They did a fantastic job finding actors who really truly resemble one another, without having to resort to the cheap fakery of digital doubles, or letting a 33-year-old actor scream himself hoarse for several hours so he can sound like his 121-year-old character.
Turn that thing on.
I beg your pardon?
I said turn that thing on and shut up. Now you just sit there and you'll learn something.
If you put that movie next to Dances with Wolves, I think Little Big Man's better. I think Little Big Man holds up better. There are a lot of Germans in this show, and they are not easy to keep track of, so the fact that they sought out performers with genuine physical resemblances goes a long way towards making that a little bit easier. But this gets us to one of my biggest criticisms of Dark. This cast is huge, and basically everyone has at least one extremely important role to play in the mechanism of the plot. That's fantastic on paper, but in execution, you really feel the limitations of its mere 26-episode run. Virtually every staple of the time travel genre gets played with in some form, which is in part what makes Dark so refreshing. It's a genre show that is primarily interested in the genre, in telling a truly expansive time travel narrative that you as a viewer have to work to understand. Yet that's also one of the show's greatest weaknesses, because the focus on all that plot leaves very little room for the characters to be characters. For all the moments where we see them reeling back with horror at the beast they're bound to become, we basically never get to see their reactions beyond that moment. There are no fireside conversations where two newly minted travelers get to commiserate over how weird it is that they're their own mom or whatever. No one attempting to make light of the situation with a few sarcastic jabs. I get that this is a German show, so naturally I'm barking up the wrong tree asking for levity and downtime, but this is my dramatic orthodoxy, and I can't help but feel that Dark misses many golden opportunities. The plot of this show is very maximalist. It throws everything at you as soon as it can reasonably concoct a way to do so. And yet, because we only have 26 episodes to work with, its means of conveyance for that plot are kind of shockingly minimalist. Just about every major plot hook is highlighted precisely once, and then paid off episodes or seasons later with little attempt to make sure that you followed the plot. It is the absolute bare minimum amount of narrative scaffolding required to tell a story this complicated in such a short amount of time, and I'll admit it makes for a really fun show to unpack with a friend precisely because you'll have a convincing complaint, but as you talk about it, you end up finding a satisfying answer to it somewhere else in the text. That's the kind of sci-fi story Dark is, where the creators clearly knew what they were doing and wanted to make sure everything you need to put the pieces together is there on screen, if only you're willing to do the work. But I think its single-minded obsession with plot over all else ultimately results in a show that isn't really about anything except itself. Early signs of being a parable against nuclear energy are thankfully averted by the conclusion, but little else rises to take its place thematically. Gestures are made at the idea that time is God and God must be destroyed, and of course there's the nihilistic determinism I've already talked about, but all of that stuff feels like window dressing to me because it isn't really attached to anything. While there are nominally two factions locked in a bitter, timeless war, I don't think it's ever explicitly stated what either of them actually stand for or what they ideologically represent. Internally speaking, there can't be any ideologies because everything is so unerringly deterministic. What someone believes is irrelevant to the inertia of time, so I guess that makes it irrelevant to the camera as well. On top of this, Dark is aggressively disinterested in the actual material history of its locations. There are no politics, there are no Nazis, we don't see the labor that builds Winden, we don't see the organizational work that its clandestine organizations are implied to have done. We see a couple of teens with slogans like No Future and Eat the Rich on their walls, but no one ever talks about class or why they may have once protested against the nuclear plant, or why the nuclear plant is closing at all. The closest we get to direct sociological commentary is with one of the show's lone queer characters, a transsexual sex worker named Bernadetta. In season 1, there's this whole back and forth of conflict around Bernadetta that had my potential transphobia incoming alarms going right off. But then in season 2, that conflict is resolved with a resounding, actually I was selling my birth control to Bernadetta because I don't need it and she can't get care, so really you're the asshole. At which point Bernadetta promptly never appears on screen again until the series finale. I can't say for sure, but I swear it feels like the showrunners were responding to Tumblr discourse in that scene, which, you know what? Considering the fact that the usual response is to just kill the queer characters, I'd call writing them off safely a pretty easy win. Still, one cannot escape the feeling that while Dark is a German-language show shot in Germany, it's clearly aimed at a primarily American audience. This is most apparent in its needle drops, which with a few exceptions are almost all in English. It is a time travel show about a place that is displaced from time and history, about which we as Americans probably have next to no knowledge of. A view from nowhere, of nowhere, interested only in the individual actions of rats caught in a maze that they themselves are building asynchronously. For all that Dark is challenging to untangle on a plot level, there's nothing in it that is so culturally specific that it might prove inaccessible to a foreign audience. The phrase I keep coming back to describe this show is clockwork mechanism, because that's what it is. an elaborate, impressively designed pocket watch of compact, almost atomically precise gears, all serving the singular purpose of moving hands around on the face of a clock. But a pocket watch, for all that its engineering might impress, is not about something, but rather of something. It is a manifestation of the post-industrial world's need to keep time, to order society and regiment the day so that labor can be managed and apportioned in a scientific manner. Whether gold encased and inlaid with precious gems, or a cheap plastic thing with a cartoon mouse on it, a watch that keeps time is of equal use value to every other watch. It can be an accessory to complement one's sense of fashion. It can be designed by someone with a unique vision of the world. It may be a family heirloom or find its origins in a surprising place. But these are all secondary contexts. They are stories that we tell around the object, but they aren't intrinsic to the object. It's perfectly fine for a show like Dark to be primarily a clockwork mechanism. I adore complex stories. I wish we got more of them like this. But television is capable of more than just clocks, don't you think? I don't care so much whether or not Dark should have been something other than what it was, but rather that it could have been. It's good that all the loose ends are tied up, that you can infer the emotional journeys of each character on your own time, but then isn't one of the great merits of television its ability to portray those emotional journeys rather than simply gesture at them? Of course, I feel like if I were to air this grievance to a particular subset of modern sci-fi likers, I'd be told that Dark is exactly as long as it needs to be. Dark is pure engine, pure clockwork, devoid of unnecessary chaff, totally unlike anything we've ever seen before. Why grouse about it? And to that standoffish straw person, I can only take a deep breath as though standing on the gallows with a noose being tightened around my neck and speak the epitaph of my credibility. I kinda think Lost and Homestuck did it better. Surprise, assholes! You thought this video was about a show you don't care about, but it's actually about 2 shows and a comic you don't care about. That's me, baby, herald of all things totally irrelevant to that demigod, the algorithm. Lost is a show that ran from 2004 to 2010, 6 seasons that total 121 episodes, about a group of survivors of a plane crash trying to survive on a deserted island. Homestuck, meanwhile, is a Flash-based hypercomic that ran from 2008 to 2016, 7 acts that total over 1,350,000 words, about a bunch of kids playing a video game whose win condition is generating a new universe that they get to be the gods of. Both are extremely contentious works in their respective mediums for reasons both legitimate and not, mostly not, to the point where they've kind of become persona non grata in casual conversation. Yet they've nevertheless had a seismic impact on absolutely everything that's followed in their wake, and I'm the poor soul who just can't let the popular slander go uncorrected. To be as brief as I possibly can, everything you've been told about these stories is wrong, in Lost's case especially. Set aside all your preconceptions, forget everything anyone but me ever told you in a video essay, and just give them an honest shot. It's not the sort of thing that's for everyone necessarily, and it's totally okay if that's the case for you, but you should at least try to experience the thing before you have an opinion on it, I think. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's silly. I don't know, shot in the dark here. The relevance these two media have to Dark is that they are both genre stories with a lot of interest in the mechanics of storytelling in general, and the mechanics of time travel specifically. In Lost's case, the time travel stuff doesn't really fully enter the scene until later seasons, but Homestuck is more holistically infatuated with these mechanics. Pretty much everything in Dark has a corollary in Homestuck. Accidental incest, bombs meant to destroy the thing they end up creating, the oppressive nature of stable time loops, the crazy-making nonsense of nested bootstrap paradoxes, bifurcated timelines, retcon mechanics, alternate self shenanigans, it's all there. I want to be clear, I compare Dark favorably to Homestuck, because it's basically the only mainstream time travel story I've encountered that even comes within the same solar system as Homestuck in terms of plot complexity. And yet, Homestuck sticks for me precisely for what Dark lacks. Pluralistically emotional character drama, humor in tandem with existential dread. Season 1 of Dark ends on the revelation that one character's attempt to blow up the time hole in the cave system is, in fact, creating the circumstances that allowed for that time hole to be opened up in the first place. Homestuck does this too, albeit on a far larger and more fantastical scale. At the end of Act 5, which is about the middle point of Homestuck, two characters named Rose and Dave set off on a suicide mission to blow up the Green Sun, a supermassive solar body that gives their antagonist all of his power. But when they set off the bomb and are subsequently surprisingly resurrected due to game mechanics, they realize that the bomb is what created the Green Sun in the first place. These are quite similar story beats, used to very similar effect. But here's what makes the difference. In Dark, the switcheroo has almost no lead time. The character dead set on blowing up the time hole announces his intention to do so in the season 1 finale, and then he goes and does it. It's only through voiceover from Claudia Tiedemann in the scene where the bomb goes off that we are told the ironic twist. Meanwhile, in Homestuck, the plan to blow up the Green Sun is talked about several times, hundreds of pages before it's put into motion. Rose and Dave spend a fair amount of time arguing over their motivations for committing to it, with Rose insisting that she go alone. Thus, the plot device becomes a vehicle for examining Rose's stubborn insistence on throwing herself into circumstances where she almost certainly is going to die. The situation around the plot device involves subterfuge happening on multiple levels, with thousands of pages of buildup. Then in the Act 6 intermissions, a fair amount of time is spent on characters processing how comprehensively they got played. These conversations reiterate the facts of what occurred in the narrative, what those facts mean to the characters, and how they connect to other going concerns. Homestuck is just as dense as Dark in the way that it can flummox you on a moment-to-moment basis, but that density contains a complex web of character drama in equal proportion to its complex plot. They are not separate, but rather complementary, each playing a role in helping the audience better understand the other. I think when it comes to speculative fiction, there's this feeling like melodrama has no place in that world, that all things which do not support the science part of the science fiction are window dressing, or that they're inherently lesser in some immutable way. Christopher Nolan's Interstellar is a great example of this, a film whose science is so science, Kip Thorne wrote a whole book about it, and yet because Anne Hathaway's character talks about love as a frontier of scientific unknowns, a lot of people write the whole thing off. They did the same thing for the same reason to Robert Zemeckis' adaptation of Carl Sagan's Contact, because God forbid the mysteries of the universe include things we wouldn't expect, I guess. Complex character drama can be just as fulfilling a clockwork mechanism as a pure science fiction time travel yarn, and there's no reason you can't do both at the same time. Humor, too, is a rare thing in Dark, in part because yeah, it's German. But also, I do think the trend right now is for genre media to take itself deadly seriously. Everything's flatly lit and expresses a mood of grim resignation to the absence of any purpose or joy. I think this comes at least a little bit from the idea that horror and comedy are mutually exclusive, which is kind of weird considering they're basically the same genre. Horror and dread and fear and misery go hand in hand with sarcasm and jokes and puns. Humor is a release valve for trauma, a means of escaping it temporarily. It doesn't fix anything, it's just how people are. As a result, Dark by its final season starts to feel profoundly constipated because again, it only has the two consistent emotional registers. That's why Katarina Nielsen's laughing, sarcastic pushback to a lore dump sticks out so much for me. And it's not even played for humor in the moment, it's still just as grim as everything else, but it tells us something unique about Katarina as a person, a rare glimpse into how she feels. And this is as good a time as any to shift gears into talking about Lost, unironically my favorite television show and a masterclass in the art of telling a complex science fiction narrative with an ensemble cast. The most important thing to understand about it stylistically is that every episode takes place in two settings. The first is on the island, following along as characters try to solve problems, while the second is a flashback to the life of a single specific character from before the crash. This means that while each episode is adding to the ongoing island story, it simultaneously simultaneously telling a self-contained character story that can operate on entirely different rules, playing with totally unrelated genres as the need arises. A Kate episode feels different from a Jack episode, feels way different from a Desmond episode, etc., etc., etc. This makes for really, really good individual episodes where you hit the credits and feel like you ate a substantial meal. To its credit, I actually think Dark takes a lot more of the right lessons from Lost than its contemporaries. In both shows, each season is designed to give you a very specific impression of the rules and limitations of its universe, only to blow up those limitations in the season finale so that the rules are expanded in the subsequent season. This is a spectacular way to avoid stagnation because it creates opportunities for new varieties of conflict, new angles on old ideas, and just new characters in general. But I want to draw your attention once again to Dark's 3-season, 26-episode run. Lost's first season alone is 23 episodes. Nothing that's truly special about Lost would be as memorable or as impactful if it were significantly shorter. I think some folks would call what I'm asking for filler with a very dismissive, if not derisive tone, but Dark is totally devoid of filler, and as a result, it feels empty. While Lost is arguably a bit too full, I'll still take an overabundance of substance over a complete absence any day of the week. And this is the televisual world we find ourselves in today, where the average season is expected to be less than 13 episodes, usually 10, often only 8, and frequently canceled before getting more than 2 or 3 seasons, regardless of popularity. So a show like Dark, in its miraculously extant final season, must sprint to close every loop, fulfill every promise, leaving absolutely no room to breathe or process. While more successful overall, it ends up feeling quite a lot like the finale of Sense8, a 2-hour film unfairly burdened with having to wrap up several entire seasons of planned story. Lost is what it is because it has the audacity to make serious adult characters confront pulpy nonsense like a hatch with a button that you have to press every 108 minutes, because maybe if you don't, then the world will explode. They devote the better part of an entire season just to the drama that naturally arises from that thought experiment. It's through the characters and the choices they make and how the story frames their choices through flashbacks and lengthy philosophical and comedic conversations that we understand why the plot even matters in the first place. Dark has good characters, but they never get the chance to sit down and talk about the things that have happened. There is no Daniel Faraday explaining the rules of deterministic time travel, no Swan Station orientation film alluding to a mysterious incident. And that's technically fine, right? Because everything that you need as a viewer to put the pieces together is there. But Lost sings its best tunes when it gives you more than just what you need. It's not just that the mysterious thing has happened, it's that these characters all react to the mysterious things happening in different ways, so the mysteries act as a personality check both inside and outside the fiction. This does nothing to reduce the clockwork mechanism of its complex sci-fi plot, but instead enhances it by imbuing it with layers of relatable, subjective meaning. And there's yet another benefit to this multi-leveled story construction. Lost and Dark are both extremely grim stories at times. Lots of death, betrayals, corruption, outright villainy, torture, and so much other stuff. And yet, on a moment-to-moment level, Lost is a pretty funny show. The dark moments are played straight and allowed time to breathe, but they are necessarily counterbalanced by moments of silliness. Like, what plot purpose does it serve when Hurley builds a golf course on the island? Strictly speaking, none whatsoever. But from an emotional and thematic perspective, it's absolutely essential, because it shows us that these are human beings with needs beyond the eternally grim march of narrative inertia. There are no comparative moments of levity in Dark, no breaks in its all-consuming nihilism, no implication that life on a day-to-day basis is anything more than waiting for death, regardless of whether or not you're a time traveler. It is sort of the anti-Lost in that respect, as my girlfriend pointed out to me. Where Dark ends on the thesis that paradise is non-existence, Lost ends by positing that paradise is something you build with the people you love in life. Where Dark is a clockwork mechanism that exists for its own sake, the clockwork of Lost is always secondary to the character drama, which isn't to say that it's unimportant, but that it is only one part of what makes a truly great story. To its credit, I think Dark is nowhere near as hobbled by its lack of flashbacks as many of its contemporaries, because again, the central plot is clearly something the creators have put a scientific level of care care into. But episode after episode, we are left to infer events and conversations that must have occurred off-screen. For instance, there's a huge reveal at one point when Jonas is approached by the elder Claudia, who recruits him to her war against Adam by flaunting a superior understanding of Wyndon's timey-wimey history. But then the next we see of Jonas, he is approaching a younger Claudia, recruiting her to the very same war, to teach her for the first time all of the things that her older self just taught him. I like that plot on paper, but again, all that we see is the plot. We don't get to hear Claudia explain anything of substance to Jonas, we don't get to hear him ask her questions, and neither do we get the reverse when the shoe is on the other foot. Yes, I think it's cool when a show demands me to fill in some gaps with educated guesses. That's a quality that I often praise about Lost, but it's just about the only trick up Dark's sleeve. Pretty much everything is a bootstrap paradox in some form or other. Every character is motivated by being told what to do by a character who was told what to do, and always because that is what happened, so that is what always has to happen. I'm not against this deterministic approach, but even if textually the characters do what they do because that's what they always did, they still have to feel some ways about it, right? It quickly comes to feel like nobody in Dark has their own personal reason for doing what they do, because we never get to hear them justify themselves out loud beyond very broad elevator pitch character motives. Without that information, without that context, Dark's plot is left out to dry because there's barely any attempt to ground that plot in the mundane worldviews of its characters. I think it's easy for folks to look at the runtime of a Lost or a Homestuck and balk. Maybe they've got a long enough watch list as it is, maybe they assume that long stories are inherently boring, maybe they're convinced that they wouldn't get anything out of it. This is particularly true for media like Lost and Homestuck, which were sudden and meteoric entries into the zeitgeist that, after a certain point, everyone decided they were embarrassed of having liked and promptly refused to talk about them seriously ever again. What do we lose by pretending that these stories have nothing to offer us? That they're cringe and embarrassing and guiltlessly disposable? What is it that makes Dark such an unquestionable classic among the same crowd that outright dismisses its more melodramatic cousins? I want to end this video by talking about Dark's worst scene, but as a quick warning, mild discussion of fictional depictions of sexual assault is incoming. Season 3 is a sprint, and it feels like one. There are so many threads that need to be tied up in just 8 episodes that very little gets time to breathe. This is most especially felt in the broader supporting cast, where stories that could be the focus of entire episodes in a show like Lost are given a scene, maybe 2. The most egregious of these by far is the story of Elizabeth Doppler, a deaf-mute girl who speaks in sign language. In Season 2, she's revealed to be one of the only survivors of the apocalypse still around in 2052, and she's got the scars to prove it. So we naturally wonder, how the hell did she get here? Where's her parents? Who gave her those scars? How did she survive all this time? And these questions intersect with much broader concerns about the setting. Where all the other time periods take place in a context we're familiar with, this future is obviously a totally unique circumstance because it's speculative. So everything in that setting has a lot more material unknowns, like where does food come from? Why has society devolved? What's up with all the huge hornet nests everywhere that never get remarked on? To be clear, the show doesn't need to explicitly answer all those questions, it just needs to gesture in the direction of one. But Elizabeth is positioned as an important character, and her importance is inextricable from the context of the post-apocalypse. So to at least some extent, we need to see how and why her childhood ended in order for her story to reach a satisfying conclusion. And so, to that end, Dark depicts Elizabeth being attacked and sexually assaulted by a total stranger who manages to kill her dad just before she bashes his brains in with a fire extinguisher. Wow. This show sure is dark. Alright, as far as scenes like this go, it's well executed. The guy who plays the freak does a good job acting his thought process out on his face, which makes for a really chilling, uncomfortable sequence. The problem is that there is nothing else like it anywhere else in the show. At no other point does a complete no-name character show up, do a thing, and then promptly exit the story, never to be remarked upon again. At no other point is sexual violence even brought up as a coherent threat. At no point have the social conditions of the post-apocalypse been explored enough for this to feel like it's in conversation with prior scenes. It is exclusively a character beat with no bootstrap items changing hands, no one with secret knowledge showing up for a dramatic monologue. This is 7 whole minutes with almost zero dialogue that exists for the sole purpose of explaining why adult Elizabeth Doppler is like that. It's not just tasteless, it's lazy. It's like, oh, what traumatized this little girl in the post-apocalypse? I know, how about an attempted What is this, The Walking Dead? I thought we moved on from this kind of juvenile, grimdark student film level story beat. This show is better than that. Like, everything else on the show is so much better than that. What are you doing? It reveals, I think, Dark's biggest weakness. And it's a weakness that, ironically, is shared by its single-season miniseries cousin, Bodies. Bodies is about 4 detectives investigating the same murder in the same location across 4 different timelines, one of them being the future. What really hooked me, though, was that each detective has something going on with them that's in direct conflict with their job and time period. The Victorian detective is gay, the Blitz-era detective is Jewish, the modern-era detective is Muslim, and the future detective is... well, that's where it all starts to fall apart. Technically, she's paraplegic, but she has a battery-powered implant on her spine that lets her walk, given to her by Britain's new fascist government as part of her job as a cop. Her similarly disabled brother angrily derides her for giving up her freedom for the privilege of using her legs. That's a juicy bit of world building, but the problem is that Bodies never takes the time to explain what freedom really means here. As episode by episode, Bodies refuses to explore the political economy of any of its settings, nor to define the political beliefs of any of its characters in more than the broadest of strokes, the series increasingly loses coherence. It's trying to be social commentary, and it almost succeeds in a few places, but it just doesn't have time to illuminate the society it's commenting on. It feels like the showrunners, or more likely the executives, were afraid of taking sides, of making a statement, of potentially alienating any viewers in the all-important 20-something fascist gamer demographic. The situation with Dark is nowhere near as bleak, but as the credits rolled on the final episode, I couldn't help but ask myself, what the hell was this show about anyway? My girlfriend suggested that it has kind of a what if there were 2 dudes on the moon and one of them killed the other with a rock, would that be messed up or what vibe? And she's not wrong. I guess it's about how much it sucks to live in a small town your whole life and feel like no matter how far away you get, it always seems to drag you back. In the fullness of its run, Dark is mostly about the existential nightmare that is growing up to become someone you wouldn't recognize as yourself today. Maybe it's about how the problems of today have shockingly relevant roots going back more than 100 years. But that's sort of pat, isn't it? There are no political dimensions here. Nobody seems to stand for anything besides a vague light or dark, life or death. So the fact that the show ends on a third way is just more plot rather than like a thematic revelation. Ultimately, I guess it's a show about a guy who built a device to multiply his trauma on an atomic level in order to reverse its cause and succeeds. Which is cool for that guy. But once there's no one left to soliloquize, the end is the beginning is the end. Once Jonas is all out of tears for how sick and twisted his life is, all we're left with is a really interesting pocket watch. A conversation piece to put on the mantle and admire every now and again. Dark is everything it needs to be, and for that it deserves to be commended. But it is only what it needs to be, and denies all else with a nihilistic determination that ultimately leaves me feeling kind of cold. But then again, I'm literally just a goat, so like, what am I even doing here, man? I should be chewing on some cans or some shit. Hello and welcome to the end of this YouTube video. I have a few things that I would like to add, but first, I want to thank my $10 supporters on Patreon and Camaraderie. Alex with a YQZ, Azrael Suzy Monique, Athiet, Bellicose, Bingus, Bobby Jane DeForge, Cam Chacon, Chthonic Syzyges, Dare, Dick Beninia, Drakenlupin, Dyke Doll, Emma Sylvia, Evan Ritchie, Halsey, JB Silpenary Wolf, Jay Jorts, J Mac D, Jordan Pye, Kate Shrike, Catherine Jibes, Now I Only Want to Triumph, Aura Barista, Patrick Feeney, Pinball Witch, Prum, Quirk, Richard Dunbeck, Rubeline, Scott Olson, Sophia, Sophie Wieberts, TB Skyen, The Girls, the internet's beloved Princess Grace, Riskazone, and the letter Z. You too can get your name read aloud in the credits of my videos by going to patreon.com/LTAS or camaraderie.co/SarahZedig. Just give me $10 a month. And then you can hear your name. How often does one really hear one's own name? Not often enough. unless you're famous. So as I've been editing this video, I realized that I sound a lot more negative about the show than I really am. I wouldn't have made this video at all if I hadn't really enjoyed the show. And I hope it comes through in the first half that I do genuinely really like this show, and I think it's an important entry in the genre, and it's worth looking at and thinking about and studying. But it's precisely because it's so good in all of these ways that it deserves to be scrutinized in other departments. It's good, but it isn't perfect. And there's no art that is good and perfect. There's no art that's perfect. That's just a fact. I want to add an addendum to my assertion that this show ultimately doesn't feel like it's about anything. I think it's a little bit too harsh. I make it sound like this show doesn't have themes and ideas, and it does. It has a lot of them. At one point I used the word subtle to describe this show, and that's just not an accurate word choice at all. The specific things that happen and when they happen and who they happen to are subtle in the sense that you need to pay a lot of attention and probably rewatch it to know those things more often than not. But in terms of the emotional weight of it, the dramatic weight of it, that's not subtle at all. Pretty much all of the villains are just saying their motivations most of the time, and they are sort of boilerplate. What's there is good, I just want more. All my criticisms aside, there are a lot of really interesting things in this show, and the ending is fascinating. I didn't talk about it very much because I tried to structure this video so that I mostly only talk about spoilers in the first season, and then kind of obliquely about certain spoilers elsewhere. I wanted to give an impression of what this show kind of is without spoiling too much of it. But the ending is interesting, and it's one that I'm still digesting it. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it. But it's not a train wreck. It's not thematically completely backwards. It's not doing a very basic morality tale. I guess it's kind of doing a morality tale about how it's important for parents and kids to talk to each other. Whatever. It's good. It's a good ending. It's a really interesting ending. Just like I said, I'm not entirely sure what it all adds up to. This was my first scripted video since the Tunic video last year. I was working on another video about the Doctor Who 60th anniversary specials, and I got kind of blocked on that. But in the midst of that, my girlfriend and I, we finished watching Dark, and we had a lot of really intense conversations about it. And I just sort of sat down and started writing and had most of a script written in a day and a half. The turnaround on this one has been 2.5, maybe 3 weeks. Yeah, I'm gonna try to carry this energy forward into this year and keep doing videos. So the last thing I want to address is that there have been a handful of comments on some of my older videos, particularly my People's Joker review, basically saying some version of, why do you say that what your pronouns are at the beginning of your video? That's weird. And I know that these comments are from people who are already probably pretty transphobic. One of them is oh yeah, that's really normal to start a conversation by telling your pronouns. YouTube video isn't a conversation. So I just want to say for posterity that the reason why I've started doing that and why I'm going to continue doing that is because I know how I look. I don't always like to dress super femme. I don't particularly like to wear makeup, but I know how I look, and I know that people get it wrong. There are bad faith assholes who will just say whatever they want, and that's just what it is. That's just how it's gonna be. But there might be somebody who gets confused and doesn't know. And so basically I put my pronouns at the very, very front just so nobody has an excuse. So that if somebody goes into the comments and he, hims me or whatever, then I don't have to pay attention to anything that they say because I gave them my pronouns. They know what my gender is, and if they don't want to respect that, then I'm not going to respect their opinions on a television show. Okay, that should be more than enough time. Thank you so much for watching this entire YouTube video. If you want to see more of my stuff, you can find me on Mastodon, Sarah Zedig at Shrike.club, co-host Sarah Zedig, Blue Sky at HMS No Fun, I think. It's either HMS No Fun or Sarah Zedig. I hope you have a good time for the rest of your life, and that nothing bad ever happens, and that you get flowers from your girlfriend on your anniversary, like I just did. Bah! 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 All right, that's it.